The lie that shaped my life didn't sound like a lie. It sounded responsible. It sounded patient. It sounded wise. I'll do it when the time is right. I said that sentence so often it stopped feeling like a delay and started feeling like a plan. I didn't rush decisions. I didn't jump into things unprepared. I waited. I waited to be more confident. I waited to feel ready. I waited for certainty to arrive and tell me it was safe to move. And waiting felt like progress. That's the danger of it. Waiting feels active even when nothing changes. At first, I genuinely believed the right time existed somewhere ahead of me. A moment when fear would quiet down. When conditions would align. When I would finally feel like the person who could handle what came next. So whenever a choice appeared, I measured it against that future moment. Not yet. Soon. After this settles down. Those words kept me calm. They also kept me still. I didn't miss my life in one dramatic moment. I missed it in increments. Opportunities arrived quietly. They didn't demand attention. They just stood there for a while and then moved on. I told myself I was being strategic. That impulsive people suffer consequences. That patience separates adults from dreamers. But patience, when it has no deadline, becomes avoidance. I didn't notice that at first. My life looked functional. Respectable. Stable enough that no one worried about me. People described me as grounded. Careful. Someone who thinks things through. I accepted that description with pride. What I didn't see was how often thinking it through ended the same way with me choosing nothing. I told myself that not choosing was also a choice. A safer one. Time passed quietly because nothing was wrong enough to force action. Days were fine. Weeks manageable. Years, unexamined. I remember a moment that should have been ordinary but wasn't. Someone asked me why I hadn't taken a chance I had talked about for years. Not accusingly. Genuinely curious. I gave the answer I always gave. It's not the right time. They nodded and then said something that stayed with me. Will it ever be? I laughed it off. Changed the subject. But the question followed me home. That night, I realized something unsettling. I had been waiting for a version of myself that never arrived. Confidence didn't show up on schedule. Certainty didn't announce itself. Fear didn't disappear just because I was patient. The right time wasn't late. It was imaginary. I started noticing how often my life felt like preparation. Like everything meaningful was always about to begin, just not yet. I planned. I organized. I optimized. But I didn't step forward. There's a quiet despair in realizing you're always almost ready. It doesn't feel like failure. It feels like delay stretched so thin it becomes permanent. I wasn't unhappy. I was suspended. My future existed as a concept rather than a direction. Something I referenced without approaching. I told myself I was protecting myself from mistakes. From embarrassment. From regret. But slowly, a different regret began to form. Not regret for things I tried and failed. Regret for things I never tried at all. I began to feel older than my years, not in my body, but in my spirit. Like someone who had lived cautiously long enough to forget what urgency felt like. I realized how often I avoided moments that demanded a decision. How easily I let windows close without touching them. Not because I didn't care. Because I cared too much about choosing perfectly. And perfection is a brutal excuse. It allows you to do nothing while believing you're being responsible. One evening, I tried to list the things I was waiting for. More money. More time. More confidence. More clarity. The list grew. Then I asked myself a harder question: what if none of those things ever arrive first? What if action is what creates them? That thought scared me more than failure ever had. Because it meant waiting wasn't neutral anymore. It was a decision. and I had been making it every day. I hadn't lost my life to a bad choice. I was losing it to postponement. And once I saw that clearly, the comfort of waiting began to feel dangerous. After that realization, waiting stopped feeling neutral. It felt active, like a force shaping my days without my consent. I began to notice how often I structured my life around postponement. I didn't just delay big decisions. I delayed feelings, conversations, even hope. Whenever something stirred inside me, excitement, fear, curiosity, I told myself to hold it steady until the timing improved. Timing became my authority. I stopped asking whether I wanted something and started asking whether I was ready for it. That question sounded responsible. It also guaranteed the same answer. Readiness never arrived. I told myself I was being cautious because I had learned from others' mistakes. I watched people rush into choices and suffer for it. I collected their stories like warnings. But I never collected stories of people who waited too long. Those stories don't get told loudly. They unfold quietly, in lives that look fine from the outside and feel empty on the inside. I realized how often I used preparation as a substitute for action. I researched instead of deciding. I planned instead of committing. I refined instead of beginning. Preparation felt productive. It also protected me from the vulnerability of trying. The moral dilemma sharpened painfully. If I continued waiting, my life would remain controlled, predictable. I would avoid mistakes that could permanently change things. I would also avoid the chance to be surprised by myself. If I stopped waiting, if I acted without guarantees, I risked choosing wrong. Losing time. Embarrassing myself. Discovering limits I couldn't explain away. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was afraid of wasting time by acting too soon. But I was already wasting it by doing nothing. That contradiction exhausted me. I began to feel a constant low-level anxiety that had no clear source. Not panic. Just pressure. As if something inside me knew I was late to my own life. I noticed how often I used future tense language. I will. I plan to. Someday. My present tense was empty. The longer I waited, the heavier action felt. Each delay added weight to the moment I imagined finally moving. Waiting doesn't freeze time. It compounds it. I became attached to the idea of a clean beginning. A moment when everything would align and I could step forward without mess. But life doesn't begin cleanly. It begins in uncertainty. That truth threatened everything I believed about control. There was a night when the mental breakdown finally surfaced, not as chaos, but as clarity. I realized I was no longer afraid of failing. I was afraid of choosing. Choosing meant responsibility. It meant owning outcomes instead of blaming timing. Waiting allowed me to believe my life was still intact, just paused. But a life on pause doesn't accumulate meaning. It accumulates distance. I imagined myself years from now, still explaining why the time wasn't right. Still adjusting plans. Still postponing. That image didn't terrify me. It hollowed me out. Because I could see how easily it would happen. How logical it would sound. How invisible the loss would be. I understood then that the right time wasn't something I was waiting for. It was something I was avoiding creating. Waiting had given me safety. It had also given me an excuse. An excuse not to risk, not to choose, not to find out who I was when certainty wasn't guaranteed. And once I saw that clearly, the comfort of waiting began to feel heavier than the fear of acting. I didn't know what I would choose yet. I didn't have clarity. But I knew this: if I kept waiting for the right time, I would eventually run out of life to place it in. The moment I stopped waiting, nothing magical happened. There was no inner signal. No sense of alignment. No feeling that the timing had finally become right. What happened instead was quieter and far more honest. I acted while still afraid. That was the real difference. I didn't wait for confidence to arrive. I didn't wait for certainty to catch up. I chose something knowing I might regret it. Knowing it might fail. Knowing it might expose how unprepared I really was. And for the first time in years, that felt like living. Fear didn't disappear when I moved. It protested loudly. It reminded me of everything I was risking. But it no longer had authority. Waiting had been my way of avoiding responsibility. Action forced me to accept it. Some outcomes were disappointing. Some doors closed immediately. Some choices revealed limits I couldn't talk my way around. And none of that destroyed me. What destroyed me was realizing how survivable action actually was. I had spent years protecting myself from outcomes that turned out to be manageable, even useful. Failure gave me information. Mistakes gave me clarity. Discomfort gave me presence. Waiting had given me nothing but time passing. I began to feel my days again. Not in a cinematic way, but in a grounded one. Mornings had weight. Decisions had texture. Even doubt felt meaningful. I stopped narrating my life in the future tense. I stopped promising myself that meaning would begin later. Some people didn't understand the change. They asked why I was moving now. Why I wasn't waiting until things were settled. I didn't argue. Because I finally understood something that doesn't translate easily: there is no settled version of life waiting for you. There is only participation. I still plan. I still think things through. But I no longer use preparation as a hiding place. I allow myself to choose before everything makes sense. There are still nights when regret whispers that I should have acted sooner. That I wasted time I can't get back. That regret is real. But it no longer paralyzes me. Because I understand this now: you don't miss your life all at once. You miss it slowly by postponing it into nothing. Waiting didn't protect me from regret. It created it. If you're listening to this and you're still waiting for the right moment, the right version of yourself, the right conditions, I won't tell you to rush. But ask yourself one honest question: what are you hoping time will give you? That action never will, because time doesn't deliver readiness. It only delivers endings. I waited for the right time for most of my life. And the truth is simple, and painful, and freeing: the right time was never ahead of me. It was always the moment I chose to stop waiting. That's when my life finally began.